Across a continuous belt of grassland stretching thousands of kilometers from eastern Asia to the fringes of Europe, a distinct pattern of human adaptation emerged, one not defined by cities, agriculture, or permanent settlement, but by movement, livestock, and survival within a highly variable environment. Between approximately 300 BCE and 200 CE, the Eurasian steppe formed one of the largest continuous ecological zones in the world. Extending from the Mongolian Plateau through Central Asia and into the Pontic-Caspian region north of the Black Sea. This environment was characterized by open grasslands, limited rainfall, and significant seasonal temperature variation. These conditions restricted the viability of intensive agriculture, particularly cereal cultivation, which depended on stable rainfall and predictable growing cycles. As a result, populations inhabiting the steppe developed subsistence strategies that differed fundamentally from those of settled agricultural societies. Archaeological and environmental studies indicate that pastoralism became the dominant economic system across this region. Communities relied primarily on herds of horses, sheep, cattle, and goats, which could be moved seasonally to exploit different grazing zones. This form of transhumance allowed populations to adapt to the steppe's ecological constraints while maintaining a stable food supply. Horse domestication, which had been established in earlier periods, became central not only to transport but also to social organization and warfare. Evidence from sites in the Altai Mountains and surrounding regions shows that horse burials, tack equipment, and riding gear were integral components of material culture by this period. The reliance on mobility shaped nearly every aspect of life on the steppe. Permanent settlements were rare, and instead, communities lived in portable dwellings, often constructed from felt and wood, which could be dismantled and transported as herds moved. This pattern of movement was not random but followed established seasonal cycles, with winter and summer pastures carefully managed. Such mobility required a high degree of environmental knowledge, including an understanding of water sources, grazing conditions, and weather patterns. Over time, this knowledge became embedded within cultural practices and transmitted across generations. Archaeological excavations in the Ordos Plateau and other regions of Inner Asia have revealed burial sites that provide insight into early nomadic societies. These burials often included grave goods such as weapons, ornaments, and horse equipment, suggesting both social differentiation and the importance of warfare. The presence of composite bows, constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, indicates advanced technological adaptation to mounted combat. These bows were particularly effective in steppe warfare due to their power and compact size, allowing use from horseback. Their widespread appearance in burial contexts suggests that they were not only practical tools but also symbols of status. Material culture across the steppe shows both regional variation and shared characteristics. Decorative motifs, metalwork techniques, and burial practices exhibit similarities across large distances, indicating patterns of cultural exchange and interaction. This connectivity was facilitated by mobility, which allowed groups to maintain contact over vast areas. Trade networks likely existed, though they were less formalized than those in settled regions. Items such as metal goods, textiles, and possibly luxury materials moved across the steppe, linking communities that were otherwise geographically dispersed. Written sources from neighboring civilizations provide additional, though often limited, information about steppe populations during this period. Chinese historical texts, particularly the Shiji, records of the Grand Historian, and the Han Shu, Book of Han, describe various nomadic groups inhabiting the northern frontiers of early imperial China. Among these, the Xiongnu Confederation is the most prominent. These records, compiled by historians such as Sima Qian, portray the Xiongnu as a formidable political and military force, capable of organizing large-scale raids and resisting imperial expansion. The Xiongnu are described as operating under a hierarchical system led by a supreme ruler known as the Chanyu. This structure suggests a level of political organization that went beyond simple tribal affiliation. While still based on kinship and personal allegiance, the Confederation incorporated multiple groups under centralized leadership, particularly during periods of military mobilization. Archaeological discoveries, including elite burial mounds at sites such as Noinula, support these textual accounts. These burials contain imported goods, including Chinese silks and lacquerware, indicating both wealth accumulation and diplomatic exchange. The relationship between the Xiongnu and later groups identified as Huns in European sources has been the subject of extensive scholarly debate. Linguistic, archaeological, and historical evidence does not provide a definitive answer, but several points of comparison have been noted. Both groups relied on mounted warfare, utilized composite bows, and organized themselves into flexible confederations capable of rapid expansion. Additionally, patterns of migration observed in Central Asia suggest that population movements could have transmitted cultural and organizational practices westward over time. Records indicate that the Xiongnu Confederation experienced internal fragmentation during the 1st century CE. Chinese sources describe divisions between northern and southern factions, with some groups submitting to Han authority while others moved further west. Although direct continuity cannot be conclusively established, this fragmentation coincides with broader patterns of movement across the Eurasian steppe. Archaeologists have identified shifts in material culture in regions west of the Altai, including changes in burial practices and weapon types, which may reflect the arrival or influence of migrating populations. The ecological structure of the steppe continued to play a decisive role in shaping these movements. Climatic fluctuations, including periods of drought or reduced pasture productivity, could have triggered migrations by placing pressure on existing resources. Such environmental stressors often led to conflict between groups competing for grazing land. In this context, mobility functioned not only as an economic strategy but also as a mechanism for conflict resolution and expansion. Groups capable of organizing effective military responses could displace others and occupy new territories. Warfare on the steppe was closely tied to mobility and horsemanship. Unlike the infantry-based armies of agricultural states, steppe forces relied primarily on cavalry. Mounted archers could move quickly across large distances, engage in ranged combat, and withdraw before sustaining significant losses. This form of warfare required coordination and discipline but did not depend on fixed supply lines or fortifications. As a result, steppe groups could operate with a degree of flexibility that often gave them an advantage in open terrain. Anthropological studies suggest that social organization within these groups was based on a combination of kinship networks and hierarchical leadership. Clan structures formed the basic units of society, but alliances between clans could be established through marriage, diplomacy, or conquest. Leadership was often contingent on the ability to distribute resources, maintain loyalty, and achieve success in warfare. This system allowed for both stability and adaptability, as leaders could rise or fall depending on their effectiveness. Burial evidence further illustrates the existence of social stratification. High-status individuals were often interred with elaborate grave goods, including weapons, ornaments, and sacrificed animals. In some cases, horse burials accompanied human remains, indicating the importance of the horse not only in life but also in ritual and status representation. These practices suggest a belief system that integrated social hierarchy with symbolic expressions of power and identity. Although written records from the steppe itself are largely absent for this period, interactions with neighboring civilizations provide indirect evidence of cultural practices. Chinese sources describe diplomatic exchanges, tribute arrangements, and conflict with steppe groups. These interactions reveal a pattern in which nomadic societies engaged with settled states both as adversaries and as participants in trade and diplomacy. Such relationships were often fluid, shifting between cooperation and conflict depending on circumstances. The absence of urban centers and written administrative systems did not imply a lack of complexity. Instead, steppe societies developed alternative forms of organization suited to their environment. Decision-making processes were likely conducted through councils of leaders, while communication relied on oral traditions and established networks of movement. This decentralized structure allowed for rapid mobilization without the constraints associated with bureaucratic systems. Over time, the cumulative effects of environmental adaptation, technological development, and social organization produced a distinct pattern of life on the Eurasian steppe. Communities were defined by their ability to move, to manage livestock, and to engage in both cooperation and conflict with neighboring groups. These characteristics would later enable steppe populations to exert influence far beyond their immediate environment. Archaeologists continue to uncover evidence that refines understanding of this period. Excavations across Central Asia and Eastern Europe reveal continuity in certain cultural practices alongside regional variation. Advances in genetic analysis have also contributed to the study of population movements, although results remain complex and sometimes inconclusive. Combined with textual sources from China and later from Roman and Byzantine authors, this evidence provides a multi-layered view of early steppe societies. By the early centuries CE, the Eurasian steppe had already produced a range of mobile, pastoral societies with shared technological and organizational traits. While their identities and affiliations varied, the underlying structures of their way of life remained consistent. These included reliance on horses, flexible political organization, and the capacity for rapid movement across large distances. Such features would later characterize groups identified in European sources as the Huns. The conditions described in this section did not produce a single unified population but rather a dynamic and interconnected set of communities. Through migration, conflict, and exchange, these groups contributed to broader patterns of interaction across Eurasia. Their movements would eventually bring them into contact with the borders of established empires, setting the stage for significant historical developments. Before we continue deeper into the history, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss future Nightfall history uploads. If you find this documentary valuable, share your thoughts by commenting on the section you found most informative or engaging. Centuries before the Huns appeared in Europe, a powerful nomadic confederation had already confronted one of the most organized and resource-rich empires of the ancient world. During the late 3rd century BCE, the political landscape of Inner Asia underwent a significant transformation with the emergence of the Xiongnu Confederation. This development is primarily documented in early Chinese historical texts, most notably the Shurji compiled by Sima Qian and later supplemented by the Han Shu. These records describe the consolidation of various nomadic groups under a centralized leadership structure, marking one of the earliest known examples of large-scale political organization on the Eurasian steppe. According to these sources, the Xiongnu were unified under a ruler known as the Chanyu, a title that denoted supreme authority over subordinate tribal leaders. This position combined military command with political leadership, enabling coordinated campaigns and the management of alliances across vast territories. The formation of this confederation is often associated with the leadership of Modu Chanyu in the late 3rd century BCE, who is described as having established control through a combination of military force and internal consolidation. His rule marked the transition from fragmented tribal groupings to a more cohesive political entity capable of sustained external engagement. Records indicate that the rise of the Xiongnu coincided with the expansion of the Han dynasty. As the Han state sought to secure its northern borders, it encountered increasingly organized resistance from nomadic groups. The resulting conflict shaped the policies of both sides. Chinese chronicles describe repeated incursions by Xiongnu forces into frontier regions, targeting agricultural settlements and supply routes. In response, the Han government initiated large-scale defensive measures, including the reinforcement and expansion of existing fortifications along its northern frontier. These fortifications, later integrated into what is known as the Great Wall of China, were not constructed as a single continuous barrier but rather as a network of walls, watchtowers, and garrisons. Their purpose was to monitor movement, delay incursions, and provide strategic depth rather than to prevent all forms of contact. Despite these efforts, the mobility of Xiongnu forces allowed them to bypass static defenses and maintain pressure on border regions. The military effectiveness of the Xiongnu was closely tied to their use of mounted archery. Composite bows, constructed from layered materials such as wood, horn, and sinew, provided both range and power while remaining compact enough for use on horseback. This technology, combined with advanced horsemanship, enabled rapid movement and flexible engagement strategies. Unlike the infantry-based armies of the Han, Xiongnu forces could conduct raids over long distances and withdraw before organized resistance could be mobilized. Chinese sources frequently emphasize the difficulty of countering such tactics, noting the speed and unpredictability of steppe warfare. Archaeological discoveries have provided additional insight into the structure and capabilities of the Xiongnu Confederation. Excavations at sites such as Noinula have revealed elite tombs containing a wide range of grave goods. These include imported Chinese silks, lacquerware, metal objects, and locally produced items such as weapons and ornaments. The presence of these materials indicates not only wealth accumulation but also participation in long-distance exchange networks. Some artifacts show clear evidence of contact with regions as far west as Central Asia, suggesting that the Xiongnu were integrated into broader patterns of Eurasian interaction. Burial practices at Noinula and similar sites also demonstrate social stratification within Xiongnu society. High-status individuals were interred with elaborate goods and, in some cases, sacrificed animals, including horses. These findings support the depiction of a hierarchical system in which elites exercised authority over subordinate groups. The combination of archaeological evidence and textual records indicates that the Xiongnu Confederation possessed both the organizational capacity and the economic resources necessary to sustain large-scale political structures. Diplomatic relations between the Xiongnu and the Han dynasty were complex and evolved over time. In addition to military conflict, both sides engaged in negotiated agreements, including treaties that involved the exchange of goods and, in some cases, marriage alliances. Chinese records describe policies such as haqin, or peace through kinship, in which imperial princesses were sent to marry Xiongnu leaders. These arrangements were intended to stabilize relations, though they were often temporary and subject to breakdown. Tribute exchanges, including the transfer of silk and grain from the Han to the Xiongnu, further illustrate the economic dimension of these interactions. The political structure of the Xiongnu Confederation allowed for a degree of flexibility that was well suited to the steppe environment. While the Chanyu held supreme authority, power was distributed among regional leaders who maintained control over their own groups. This decentralized arrangement enabled rapid mobilization while preserving local autonomy. However, it also introduced potential instability, as internal divisions could emerge when central authority weakened. By the 1st century CE, records indicate that the Xiongnu Confederation began to experience internal fragmentation. Chinese sources describe a division between northern and southern factions, with the southern group increasingly aligning with the Han state. This split reduced the overall cohesion of the confederation and altered the balance of power in the region. The northern Xiongnu, facing both internal challenges and external pressure, began to move westward into Central Asia. Archaeological evidence supports the occurrence of population movements during this period. Changes in burial styles, weapon types, and material culture have been identified in regions west of the Altai Mountains, suggesting the arrival or influence of new groups. While it is not possible to establish a direct and continuous link between the Xiongnu and the later Huns of Europe, these movements provide a plausible mechanism for the transmission of cultural and organizational practices across the steppe. Scholarly analysis has identified several points of continuity between the Xiongnu and later nomadic confederations. These include the use of mounted archery, reliance on mobile pastoralism, and the formation of hierarchical yet flexible political structures. Such similarities do not necessarily indicate direct descent, but rather reflect a shared adaptation to the environmental and strategic conditions of the Eurasian steppe. Over time, these patterns would reappear in various forms among different groups, including those identified in European sources as the Huns. The decline of the Xiongnu Confederation did not mark the end of steppe political organization but rather a transition to new configurations. As authority fragmented, smaller groups emerged, some of which integrated into neighboring states while others continued to migrate. These processes contributed to a dynamic and continually evolving landscape across Inner Asia and beyond. By the end of the 1st century CE, the Xiongnu had ceased to exist as a unified political entity, but the structures they developed, centralized leadership within a confederative system, reliance on mobility, and strategic engagement with settled empires remained influential. These features would later characterize other steppe powers and play a significant role in shaping interactions between nomadic and sedentary societies across Eurasia. As Eastern confederations fragmented and populations adjusted to shifting political and environmental conditions, migratory pressures increasingly directed movement westward, setting the stage for future encounters with the frontiers of Europe. By the late 4th century CE, a previously unrecorded force had appeared along the northern frontiers of the Black Sea, initiating a sequence of events that would rapidly alter the balance of power across Europe. During the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the Eurasian steppe experienced a period of sustained movement and instability. A combination of environmental pressures, shifting political alliances, and competition for grazing land contributed to the gradual westward migration of multiple nomadic groups. Climatic fluctuations, including episodes of reduced pasture productivity, are believed to have played a role in encouraging mobility, particularly in the eastern steppe regions. At the same time, the fragmentation of earlier confederations created conditions in which smaller groups sought new territories, often displacing or absorbing other populations in the process. Archaeological evidence supports the occurrence of these movements across Central Asia and into the western steppe. Changes in burial practices, including the introduction of steppe-style grave goods and alterations in skeletal remains, have been identified in regions extending toward the Pontic-Caspian steppe. These findings indicate the arrival of new populations with distinct cultural traits, including advanced horse equipment and composite bows designed for mounted warfare. Such developments reflect a continuity of steppe military traditions, adapted to new geographic contexts as groups moved westward. By approximately 370 CE, written accounts from the Roman world begin to document the presence of these migrating groups. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus provides one of the earliest detailed descriptions. In his Residential Gesti, he refers to a group identified as the Huns, describing them as highly mobile and unfamiliar in both appearance and tactics compared to known European populations. Although his account reflects the perspective of an external observer, it remains a critical source for understanding the initial encounters between steppe nomads and the Roman frontier. According to these records, the Huns first appeared in regions north of the Black Sea, an area inhabited by a variety of established groups, including the Alans and the Ostrogoths. These populations had developed their own political structures and occupied territories that provided access to both steppe resources and trade routes. The arrival of the Huns disrupted this balance. Contemporary sources describe rapid and decisive military engagements in which the Alans were defeated and either incorporated into Hunnic forces or displaced. Following these initial confrontations, the Huns advanced further into territories controlled by the Ostrogoths. The Gothic leader Ermanaric, who had presided over a substantial regional power, is reported to have faced significant pressure from the advancing Huns. Although details vary among sources, the outcome was a collapse of Gothic resistance in the region. Some Gothic groups were absorbed into Hunnic alliances, while others moved westward to escape further conflict. This pattern of displacement reflects a broader dynamic in which steppe incursions triggered cascading movements among neighboring populations. The military effectiveness of the Huns during this period can be attributed to their reliance on mounted archery and coordinated mobility. Their use of composite bows allowed for sustained ranged attacks while maintaining distance from opposing forces. Combined with rapid maneuverability, this approach enabled them to engage and disengage with relative ease. Roman and Gothic sources consistently emphasize the difficulty of confronting such tactics using conventional infantry-based formations. This imbalance contributed to the speed with which the Huns were able to establish dominance over existing groups in the region. Archaeological findings from the Pontic steppe reinforce these accounts. Excavations have revealed the presence of steppe-style weaponry, including recurved bows and specialized horse gear, appearing alongside or replacing earlier material cultures. Burial sites from this period often show a mixture of traditions, suggesting processes of cultural integration and adaptation. In some cases, individuals were interred with both local and steppe-associated artifacts, indicating the incorporation of diverse groups within emerging Hunnic networks. The arrival of the Huns also had indirect consequences that extended beyond immediate military encounters. As Gothic groups were displaced from their territories, many sought refuge within the borders of the Roman Empire. This movement is particularly evident in the case of the Thervingi, a Gothic group that approached Roman authorities in 376 CE requesting permission to cross the Danube River. Roman sources, including Ammianus Marcellinus, describe the subsequent settlement of these groups within imperial territory under conditions that were intended to regulate their integration. However, the rapid influx of displaced populations placed significant strain on Roman administrative and logistical systems. Mismanagement, resource shortages, and tensions between local authorities and incoming groups contributed to instability within frontier regions. These developments culminated in open conflict, most notably the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where Roman forces suffered a significant defeat. While the Huns were not directly involved in this engagement, their earlier actions had set in motion the sequence of events that led to it. This period marks the beginning of what historians refer to as the migration period, characterized by large-scale movements of peoples across Europe and the transformation of existing political structures. The role of the Huns in initiating these movements is widely recognized, although it is understood as part of a broader system of interactions rather than a single causal factor. Their arrival introduced a new dynamic into the region, one defined by mobility, flexible alliances, and the capacity to project force over considerable distances. Despite their growing influence, the Huns during this phase did not yet constitute a centralized empire. Their organization remained based on tribal alliances and leadership networks, with authority distributed among multiple figures. This structure allowed for adaptability and rapid response to changing conditions but also limited the degree of long-term cohesion. Leadership was often contingent on military success and the ability to maintain loyalty among diverse groups, including both nomadic and sedentary populations. Over time, the Huns expanded their sphere of influence across the western steppe, incorporating or subordinating various groups. This process was not uniform and involved a combination of coercion, negotiation, and integration. Some populations retained a degree of autonomy while contributing to Hunnic military campaigns, while others were more fully absorbed. The resulting configuration was a complex network of relationships rather than a territorially defined state. The cumulative impact of these developments was a significant reconfiguration of the European frontier. Established populations were displaced, new alliances formed, and existing political systems were challenged. The Roman Empire, in particular, faced increasing difficulty in managing its borders and maintaining internal stability. The events initiated by the westward movement of the Huns would continue to unfold over subsequent decades, influencing both regional and imperial dynamics. By the end of the 4th century CE, the presence of the Huns in Europe had become an established factor in the geopolitical landscape. Their initial appearance, recorded in Roman sources, marked the beginning of a sustained period of interaction between steppe nomads and settled empires. These interactions would shape the course of late antiquity and contribute to the transformation of the Roman world. As displaced populations continued to move toward and across Roman borders, the pressures on imperial systems intensified, creating conditions in which stability became increasingly difficult to maintain. Unlike territorial empires built around cities and fixed institutions, Hunnic authority developed through movement, personal allegiance, and the ability to command and redistribute resources across a shifting network of peoples. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, the Huns had established a recognizable system of political organization across the regions north of the Danube and Black Sea. Although this system did not resemble the bureaucratic states of the Roman world, it demonstrated a clear hierarchy and operational coherence. Authority was concentrated in the hands of dominant leaders, often described in Roman sources as kings or warlords, who exercised control over both Hunnic groups and subordinate populations. This authority was not institutionalized through written law or administrative offices, but was instead maintained through personal relationships, military success, and the distribution of wealth. Contemporary accounts provide valuable insight into this structure. The Eastern Roman diplomat and historian Priscus, who visited the Hunnic court in the mid-5th century CE, offers one of the most detailed descriptions of their society. His writings depict a political environment centered around the ruler's court, where decisions were made, tribute was received, and diplomatic exchanges were conducted. Although Priscus wrote during the reign of Attila, many of the practices he describes likely developed during the preceding decades as Hunnic leadership became more consolidated. Leadership within Hunnic society operated through a system of layered authority. At the highest level were principal rulers who commanded large coalitions of tribes. Beneath them were subordinate leaders who retained control over their own groups while acknowledging the supremacy of a dominant figure. This arrangement allowed for both unity and flexibility. Subordinate leaders could mobilize their followers independently but were expected to contribute to larger campaigns when called upon. This system of confederation enabled the Huns to coordinate military action across wide geographic areas without relying on centralized administration. Kinship ties played a significant role in maintaining political cohesion. Alliances were often reinforced through marriage, fostering connections between ruling families and subordinate groups. These relationships extended beyond immediate family structures, creating broader networks of loyalty that could be activated in times of conflict. However, kinship alone was insufficient to sustain authority. Leaders were also expected to demonstrate their effectiveness through success in warfare and the acquisition of resources, which could then be redistributed to followers. The distribution of wealth was a central mechanism of governance within Hunnic society. Resources were obtained through a combination of pastoral production, raiding, and tribute from neighboring states. Once acquired, these resources were allocated by the ruling elite to maintain loyalty among subordinate leaders and warriors. Items such as gold, livestock, weapons, and luxury goods served both practical and symbolic functions. The ability of a leader to provide for their followers directly influenced their legitimacy and stability within the confederation. Records indicate that interactions with the Eastern Roman Empire became a major source of wealth during this period. Treaties negotiated between Hunnic leaders and Roman authorities often included substantial payments in gold and goods. These arrangements were not merely economic but also political, as they reinforced the status of Hunnic rulers and provided resources necessary for maintaining internal cohesion. Roman sources frequently refer to these payments as tribute, though their interpretation varied depending on perspective. Social structure within Hunnic society was hierarchical but fluid. At the top were the ruling elites, who controlled access to resources and directed military activity. Below them were various subordinate groups, including allied tribes and incorporated populations. Many of these groups retained elements of their original identity while participating in the broader Hunnic system. Captive populations, acquired through warfare, were also integrated into this structure. These individuals could serve in military roles or contribute to the economic base of the confederation. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of this stratified society. Burial sites across the Carpathian Basin and surrounding regions reveal clear distinctions in grave goods and construction. High-status burials often contain weapons, ornaments, and imported materials, indicating both wealth and external connections. In contrast, lower-status graves are simpler, with fewer accompanying items. The presence of cauldrons, a recurring feature in Hunnic archaeological contexts, suggests communal practices that may have held social or ritual significance. Material culture from this period reflects a combination of steppe traditions and influences from conquered or allied populations. Items such as belt fittings, weaponry, and decorative objects exhibit stylistic elements drawn from both Central Asian and European sources. This blending of cultural traits indicates a process of adaptation as the Huns expanded into new regions. Rather than imposing a uniform culture, they incorporated elements from different groups, creating a hybrid system that could accommodate diversity while maintaining overall cohesion. The absence of permanent urban centers did not prevent the development of organized political activity. Instead, the Huns operated through mobile courts that could relocate as needed. These courts functioned as centers of decision-making and coordination, allowing leaders to respond quickly to changing circumstances. Diplomatic envoys, such as those sent by the Eastern Roman Empire, traveled to these courts to negotiate treaties and deliver tribute. The mobility of these centers made them difficult for adversaries to target and contributed to the resilience of the system. Military organization was closely integrated with political structure. Leaders were expected to command forces directly, and their authority was reinforced through participation in campaigns. The composition of Hunnic armies reflected the diversity of the confederation, with units drawn from various subordinate groups. This arrangement allowed for the rapid assembly of large forces, though it also required effective coordination to maintain cohesion during operations. The success of this system depended on the ability of leaders to balance autonomy with collective action. Over time, the combination of decentralized authority, resource redistribution, and flexible alliances enabled the Huns to maintain control over a wide and varied population. Their system differed fundamentally from that of sedentary empires, relying less on territory and more on relationships between people and groups. This approach allowed for rapid expansion but also introduced vulnerabilities, particularly in maintaining unity across diverse populations. By the early 5th century CE, the Huns had established a political framework capable of supporting sustained interaction with major powers such as the Eastern Roman Empire. Their ability to extract resources, coordinate military campaigns, and integrate multiple groups into a functioning system demonstrates a level of organization that was both adaptive and effective within the context of the Eurasian steppe. With these political and social structures in place, the Huns were positioned to expand their influence further, increasingly directing their efforts toward organized military campaigns and the consolidation of power across Eastern Europe. For the Huns, economic strength did not depend on agriculture, taxation, or urban production, but on the systematic extraction of wealth from surrounding states. By the early 5th century CE, the Huns had developed a distinct economic model centered on mobility and external resource acquisition. Unlike sedentary empires, which relied on agricultural output and administrative taxation, the Hunnic system functioned through a combination of pastoral subsistence, raiding, and, most significantly, the organized extraction of tribute. This approach allowed them to sustain political cohesion and military capability without establishing permanent infrastructure or urban centers. The relationship between the Huns and the Eastern Roman Empire became the primary channel through which this economic system operated. Roman authorities, facing repeated incursions and the difficulty of countering mobile steppe forces, increasingly turned to negotiated settlements. These agreements often required the payment of substantial quantities of gold and goods in exchange for peace or the cessation of raids. While Roman sources frequently framed these payments as diplomatic arrangements, the scale and regularity of the transfers indicate a structured system of tribute. Records indicate that one of the earliest formalized arrangements occurred under the Hunnic leader Ulden in the early 5th century. Although details of these initial agreements are limited, they established a precedent for later negotiations. By the time of Attila's rise in the mid-5th century, tribute payments had become both standardized and significantly increased. Treaties such as the one concluded at Margus in 435 CE specified precise amounts of gold to be delivered annually, along with provisions governing trade and the return of fugitives. These agreements demonstrate a high degree of organization in Hunnic diplomatic practice. The historian Priscus provides detailed accounts of diplomatic missions to the Hunnic court. His writings describe the process by which Roman envoys delivered tribute, negotiated terms, and interacted with Hunnic leadership. According to Priscus, these exchanges were conducted within a formalized setting, with established protocols and expectations. The presence of interpreters, officials, and ceremonial practices indicates that Hunnic diplomacy operated with a level of sophistication comparable to that of their Roman counterparts. The economic impact of these tribute payments on the Eastern Roman Empire was substantial. Gold reserves were diverted from other state functions, including military expenditures and infrastructure maintenance, to meet Hunnic demands. Roman sources reflect concern over the sustainability of these payments, particularly as the amounts increased over time. In some cases, failure to deliver tribute resulted in renewed Hunnic incursions, reinforcing the coercive nature of the system. This dynamic created a cycle in which tribute payments temporarily stabilized relations but also incentivized further demands. In addition to tribute, trade played a secondary but important role in the Hunnic economy. Agreements between the Huns and the Eastern Roman Empire often included provisions for regulated trade along designated frontier zones. These markets facilitated the exchange of goods, such as textiles, metalwork, weapons, and livestock. While trade was nominally voluntary, it existed within a broader framework shaped by Hunnic military power and diplomatic leverage. The movement of goods across these networks contributed to the circulation of wealth within the Hunnic confederation. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of long-distance exchange networks extending beyond the Roman frontier. Finds from Hunnic period sites include imported items such as Roman coins, glassware, and luxury goods, as well as materials originating from Central Asia. These artifacts indicate that the Huns were integrated into wider systems of exchange, linking the Eurasian steppe with both eastern and western regions. The presence of such goods in elite burials suggests that access to imported items was associated with status and authority. The distribution of wealth within Hunnic society was closely tied to the maintenance of political cohesion. Leaders who received tribute and trade goods redistributed these resources to subordinate elites and warriors. This process reinforced loyalty and ensured the continued functioning of the confederation. Unlike taxation systems in sedentary states, which were institutionalized and bureaucratic, Hunnic redistribution operated through personal relationships and obligations. The ability of a leader to provide material rewards was directly linked to their authority. Livestock remained an essential component of the Hunnic economy, providing food, transport, and raw materials. However, pastoral production alone was insufficient to sustain the scale of political and military activity achieved by the Huns during this period. The integration of tribute and trade allowed them to supplement their subsistence base with external resources, enabling expansion without the need for agricultural development. This combination of internal and external economic strategies contributed to the resilience of the system. Roman legislation and diplomatic correspondence from the period reflect ongoing efforts to manage relations with the Huns. Imperial authorities sought to regulate trade, control the movement of goods, and limit the outflow of valuable resources. Despite these measures, enforcement proved difficult, particularly along extensive and porous frontiers. The mobility of Hunnic groups allowed them to exploit weaknesses in Roman defenses and to respond quickly to changes in policy or circumstance. The economic relationship between the Huns and the Eastern Roman Empire was therefore characterized by a balance of negotiation and coercion. Tribute payments reduced the immediate threat of invasion but did not eliminate it, while trade provided mutual benefits within a context shaped by unequal power dynamics. This system allowed the Huns to accumulate significant wealth without developing permanent economic infrastructure, relying instead on their ability to project force and influence. Over time, the concentration of wealth in the hands of leading figures contributed to the consolidation of authority within the Hunnic confederation. Leaders who controlled access to tribute and trade goods were able to strengthen their position relative to rivals, attracting followers and expanding their influence. This process created conditions in which a single dominant leader could emerge, supported by both material resources and established networks of allegiance. By the mid-5th century CE, the economic foundations of Hunnic power had reached a level of complexity and scale that supported broader ambitions. The combination of tribute extraction, controlled trade, and resource redistribution enabled sustained military activity and political expansion. At the same time, the reliance on external sources of wealth introduced dependencies that would shape future developments. As wealth accumulated and control over its distribution became increasingly centralized, the conditions were established for the emergence of a single dominant ruler capable of unifying the Hunnic confederation under more cohesive leadership. By the mid-5th century CE, a confederation once defined by shifting alliances and decentralized authority had come under the control of a single leader whose decisions would shape the balance of power across Europe. The emergence of Attila the Hun as the dominant figure within the Hunnic confederation marked a decisive shift in its political structure. Following the death of his uncle Rugila around 434 CE, leadership passed jointly to Attila and his brother Bleda. This dual kingship reflected earlier steppe traditions, in which authority could be shared among members of a ruling lineage. However, the arrangement appears to have been transitional rather than permanent, as power increasingly concentrated in Attila's hands over the following decade. Contemporary accounts, particularly those of Priscus, provide insight into the nature of Attila's rule. Priscus, who visited the Hunnic court as part of a diplomatic mission, describes a political environment in which authority was clearly centralized. Although subordinate leaders retained local influence, ultimate decision-making rested with Attila. His court functioned as the focal point of governance, diplomacy, and resource distribution, reinforcing his position as the primary source of power within the confederation. The circumstances surrounding the death of Bleda remain uncertain, but sources suggest that Attila became sole ruler by approximately 445 CE. Later accounts, including those of Jordan's, imply that Bleda may have been removed through internal conflict, although definitive evidence is lacking. Regardless of the exact cause, the result was the consolidation of authority under a single leader. This transition reduced the potential for internal rivalry and allowed for more coordinated decision-making across the Hunnic domains. Attila's leadership combined traditional steppe practices with an expanded scale of organization. Like earlier Hunnic rulers, he relied on personal loyalty, kinship ties, and the redistribution of wealth to maintain control. However, he also extended these mechanisms to a broader network of subordinate groups, including Germanic and Iranian-speaking populations integrated into the confederation. These groups were required to provide military support and, in return, received a share of the resources acquired through tribute and conquest. Records indicate that Attila actively strengthened his authority by asserting control over these subordinate leaders. This process involved both coercion and negotiation, as well as the strategic use of military force when necessary. By reinforcing hierarchical relationships within the confederation, Attila was able to create a more unified political structure while preserving the flexibility characteristic of steppe systems. This balance between central authority and local autonomy proved essential in managing a diverse and geographically dispersed population. Diplomatic relations with the Eastern Roman Empire played a central role in Attila's consolidation of power. Building on earlier agreements, he renegotiated the terms of tribute to increase both the scale and regularity of payments. The Treaty of Margus, concluded in 435 CE, established provisions that significantly expanded Roman obligations. These included increased annual payments of gold, restrictions on Roman alliances with Hunnic subjects, and the return of fugitives who had sought refuge within imperial territory. According to Priscus, these agreements were enforced through a combination of diplomatic pressure and the implicit threat of military action. When Roman authorities failed to meet their obligations, Attila responded with campaigns into the Balkans, targeting urban centers and strategic locations. Cities such as Nisus and Serdica were attacked during these operations, demonstrating the capacity of Hunnic forces to penetrate deep into imperial territory. These actions reinforced the credibility of Attila's demands and ensured the continuation of tribute flows. The accumulation of wealth from these arrangements further strengthened Attila's position within the confederation. Gold and goods obtained from the Eastern Roman Empire were redistributed to subordinate leaders and warriors, reinforcing loyalty and facilitating the expansion of his influence. This process not only sustained the economic base of Hunnic power but also created a system in which political authority was closely tied to control over external resources. Material and textual evidence suggests that Attila maintained a court that combined elements of steppe tradition with influences from neighboring civilizations. Priscus describes a setting in which diplomatic envoys were received, feasts were held, and political matters were discussed. Although the court remained mobile, it functioned as a central hub for coordination and communication. The presence of interpreters, officials, and structured ceremonial practices indicates a level of organization that extended beyond informal leadership. Attila's approach to governance also included the management of internal stability. By maintaining clear lines of authority and ensuring the regular distribution of resources, he minimized the risk of fragmentation within the confederation. At the same time, his reliance on personal authority meant that the system remained dependent on his leadership. Unlike institutionalized states, where power could be transferred through established mechanisms, the Hunnic structure was closely tied to the capabilities of its ruler. Military organization under Attila reflected this centralized authority. Campaigns were planned and directed from the top, with subordinate leaders contributing forces as required. The integration of diverse groups into a unified military system allowed for large-scale operations across multiple regions. This capacity for coordinated action distinguished Attila's rule from earlier phases of Hunnic activity, which had been more fragmented and localized. The expansion of Hunnic influence during this period extended beyond direct control. Through a combination of tribute, alliances, and military pressure, Attila established a sphere of influence that encompassed much of Eastern Europe. This network of relationships allowed him to project power without the need for permanent occupation of territory. Instead, control was exercised through the ability to mobilize forces and enforce agreements across a wide area. By the mid-5th century CE, the Hunnic Confederation had reached a level of political unity not previously achieved. The consolidation of power under Attila created a more cohesive and effective system, capable of sustained interaction with major powers such as the Eastern Roman Empire. This transformation was the result of both structural developments within Hunnic society and the strategic decisions of its leadership. As authority became increasingly centralized and resources accumulated under Attila's control, the Huns were positioned to undertake more ambitious military campaigns, extending their operations beyond regional conflicts toward direct engagement with both Eastern and Western Roman territories. To the height of their power, Hunnic armies advanced beyond the steppe and into the core territories of the Roman world, demonstrating a capacity for sustained military operations across vast and varied landscapes. Between 440 and 451 CE, the Hunnic confederation under Attila the Hun conducted a series of coordinated military campaigns that extended their influence across Eastern and Western Europe. These campaigns were directed primarily against the Eastern Roman Empire, though later operations would also target the Western provinces. The scale and frequency of these incursions reflected both the consolidation of Hunnic power and the strategic use of military force to enforce political and economic demands. The initial phase of these campaigns focused on the Balkans, a region that formed a critical frontier for the Eastern Roman Empire. Following disputes over tribute payments and treaty violations, Attila launched offensives that penetrated deep into imperial territory. According to contemporary sources, including the accounts of Priscus, Hunnic forces captured and destroyed a number of fortified cities. Among these were Nisus and Serdica, both of which held strategic importance due to their location along key communication and trade routes. Roman defensive systems, though extensive, proved insufficient against the operational methods employed by the Huns. Traditional fortifications and garrison positions were designed to resist prolonged sieges or conventional assaults. In contrast, Hunnic forces relied on rapid movement, coordinated cavalry maneuvers, and the ability to strike multiple targets in succession. This approach disrupted Roman logistics and limited the effectiveness of centralized command structures. As a result, imperial responses were often delayed or fragmented, allowing Hunnic forces to achieve localized superiority. Records indicate that these Balkan campaigns resulted in significant economic and infrastructural damage. Urban centers were looted, agricultural lands were disrupted, and population displacement increased. In response, the Eastern Roman government was compelled to renegotiate terms with Attila, leading to further increases in tribute payments. These outcomes demonstrate the integration of military action with broader strategic objectives, in which warfare functioned as a mechanism for enforcing economic and political demands. By the late 440s CE, Attila had established a pattern of alternating between diplomatic negotiation and military pressure. This approach allowed him to maintain a continuous flow of resources while minimizing the risks associated with prolonged conflict. However, as the Eastern Roman Empire strengthened its defenses and adjusted its strategies, Attila began to redirect his focus toward the western provinces. In 451 CE, Hunnic forces crossed into Gaul, marking a significant expansion of their operational range. This campaign brought them into direct conflict with the Western Roman Empire and its allies. The advance into Gaul involved the movement of a large and diverse force, including not only Hunnic warriors but also contingents from subordinate tribes. This composition reflects the confederative nature of Hunnic military organization, in which multiple groups contributed to large-scale operations under centralized leadership. The response to this invasion was coordinated by the Roman general Flavius Aetius, who formed a coalition of Roman and allied forces, including the Visigoths. This alliance represented a strategic effort to counter the Hunnic advance through combined resources and coordinated action. The resulting confrontation occurred at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, one of the most significant engagements of the period. Although detailed accounts of the battle vary, sources agree that the engagement was extensive and involved substantial losses on both sides. The coalition forces succeeded in halting Attila's advance, preventing further penetration into Gaul. While the outcome did not constitute a decisive defeat for the Huns, it limited their immediate capacity for expansion in the region. The death of the Visigothic king Theodoric I during the battle further illustrates the scale and intensity of the conflict. The following year, in 452 CE, Attila initiated a campaign into the Italian peninsula. This operation demonstrated the continued ability of Hunnic forces to project power into core Roman territories. Cities in northern Italy, including Aquileia, were targeted, with archaeological evidence indicating widespread destruction. The fall of Aquileia, in particular, is noted in both literary and material sources as a significant event, reflecting the vulnerability of even well-established urban centers. Despite these successes, the Italian campaign did not result in sustained occupation. Several factors contributed to Attila's decision to withdraw. Contemporary sources suggest that logistical challenges, including supply limitations and the effects of disease, reduced the effectiveness of Hunnic forces. Additionally, diplomatic efforts by Roman representatives, possibly including negotiations involving Pope Leo I, may have influenced the outcome. While the exact weight of these factors remains debated, their combined effect led to the cessation of the campaign. The military operations conducted during this period highlight the adaptability and effectiveness of Hunnic strategy. Their reliance on mobility, combined with the integration of diverse forces, allowed them to operate across a wide geographic area. At the same time, the limitations encountered during the Italian campaign illustrate the constraints imposed by extended operations in unfamiliar and resource-limited environments. Throughout these campaigns, the Huns demonstrated an ability to exploit weaknesses in Roman defenses while maintaining cohesion within their own forces. Their success depended not only on tactical advantages but also on the broader system of alliances and resource distribution that supported military activity. The coordination required for campaigns of this scale indicates a level of organizational capacity that extended beyond earlier phases of Hunnic expansion. By the early 450s CE, the Hunnic confederation had reached the peak of its military reach, engaging both Eastern and Western Roman forces in sustained operations. However, these campaigns also exposed structural challenges, including the difficulty of maintaining long-distance supply and the reliance on continuous resource inflow. These factors would become increasingly significant in the years that followed. Despite their demonstrated military capabilities and territorial reach, the pressures associated with sustained expansion, both internal and external, began to place increasing strain on the cohesion and stability of Hunnic power. To its height, Hunnic authority extended across a vast expanse of Europe and Eurasia, maintaining control not through fixed institutions, but through mobile power structures and centralized leadership. By the early 450s CE, the Hunnic confederation under Attila the Hun had reached its maximum territorial and political extent. This sphere of influence stretched from the Volga River in the east to the regions of Central Europe in the west, encompassing a wide range of ecological zones and populations. Unlike sedentary empires, this territorial reach was not defined by fixed borders, but by networks of allegiance, tribute, and military dominance. Control was maintained through a system of subordinate tribes, each integrated into the broader structure of Hunnic authority. These subordinate groups included various Germanic and steppe origin peoples, among them the Ostrogoths, Gepids, and Alans. Their inclusion within the Hunnic system reflects a pattern of incorporation rather than direct administration. These groups retained elements of their own leadership structures while providing military support and tribute to Attila. This arrangement allowed for rapid mobilization of large, multi-ethnic forces, increasing the overall military capacity of the confederation. According to accounts by Priscus, who visited Attila's court as part of a diplomatic mission, the Hunnic leadership maintained a central political hub despite the absence of a permanent capital. Priscus describes a royal residence constructed of wood, surrounded by the dwellings of subordinate elites. This site functioned as a focal point for diplomatic activity, where envoys from both the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire were received. These interactions demonstrate the recognition of Hunnic authority within the broader international system of late antiquity. The economic foundation of this imperial structure was based largely on tribute extraction. Agreements negotiated with the Eastern Roman Empire required the regular transfer of gold, goods, and other resources. These payments reached their highest levels during Attila's reign, reflecting both the strength of Hunnic military pressure and the strategic importance of maintaining peace along imperial frontiers. Records indicate that the annual tribute increased significantly following successive treaties, placing considerable strain on Roman finances. This flow of wealth supported the internal cohesion of the Hunnic confederation. Resources obtained through tribute were redistributed among subordinate leaders and warriors, reinforcing loyalty and sustaining the hierarchical structure of power. This system of distribution replaced the need for formal taxation or bureaucratic administration. However, it also created a dependency on continuous external resource acquisition, linking political stability directly to the success of military and diplomatic efforts. Material culture from this period reflects the integration of diverse influences within the Hunnic world. Archaeological findings, including weaponry, horse equipment, and ornamental objects, show a combination of steppe traditions and elements derived from Roman and other settled societies. Elite burials from regions under Hunnic control often contain imported goods, indicating participation in long-distance exchange networks. These findings support the interpretation of the Hunnic confederation as a dynamic and interconnected system rather than an isolated nomadic group. The administrative structure of Attila's rule remained relatively simple in comparison to contemporary empires. There is limited evidence of formal institutions or codified legal systems. Instead, authority was exercised through personal relationships, reinforced by displays of power and the strategic distribution of wealth. Decision-making processes were concentrated around Attila and his immediate circle, with subordinate leaders acting as intermediaries between the central authority and local populations. This concentration of power contributed to the effectiveness of the Hunnic system during its peak. The absence of complex administrative layers allowed for rapid decision-making and adaptability in response to changing conditions. Military campaigns could be organized quickly, and alliances could be adjusted as needed. At the same time, this structure lacked mechanisms for long-term stability independent of individual leadership. Diplomatic relations during this period were characterized by a combination of negotiation and coercion. Envoys sent to Attila's court were required to adhere to strict protocols, reflecting the hierarchical nature of interactions between the Huns and other states. Accounts from Priscus describe the formal reception of ambassadors, the exchange of gifts, and the negotiation of treaties. These practices indicate a level of diplomatic sophistication that complemented the Confederation's military capabilities. Despite the apparent strength of the Hunnic Empire at its zenith, underlying vulnerabilities were present within its structure. The reliance on tribute created an economic system dependent on external factors, including the stability and resources of neighboring states. Additionally, the integration of diverse tribal groups required continuous management of alliances and potential rivalries. Without a stable institutional framework, the cohesion of the Confederation depended heavily on the authority and effectiveness of its central leader. The geographic extent of Hunnic influence also presented challenges. Maintaining control over distant regions required constant movement and coordination, limiting the ability to establish permanent administrative centers. Communication across such a wide area depended on established networks of messengers and the mobility of leadership, which could become strained during periods of conflict or transition. By the early 450s CE, the Hunnic Confederation had achieved a level of power that positioned it as a dominant force in European and Eurasian affairs. Its influence extended into the political, economic, and military spheres of neighboring regions, shaping the dynamics of late antiquity. However, the very factors that enabled this rapid rise, mobility, centralized leadership, and reliance on external resources, also defined the limits of its long-term stability. The continuity of this system remained closely tied to the presence of Attila as its central figure. With the death of a single ruler, a confederation that had dominated much of Europe for decades began to lose its structural cohesion. In 453 CE, the death of Attila the Hun marked a decisive turning point in the history of the Hunnic Confederation. Contemporary sources, including accounts recorded by Jordans, describe Attila's sudden death during a wedding feast, though the precise cause remains uncertain. Regardless of the circumstances, the immediate consequence was the removal of the central authority upon which the cohesion of the Hunnic system depended. Unlike sedentary empires with established institutions, the Hunnic political structure relied heavily on personal leadership, and no equivalent mechanism existed to ensure a stable transition of power. Following Attila's death, leadership passed to his sons, including Elik, Dengisik, and Ernak. However, this division of authority did not result in a unified command. Instead, competing claims and the absence of a dominant figure weakened central control. The Confederation, which had previously been held together through a combination of military success and resource distribution, began to fragment as subordinate leaders reassessed their positions within the power structure. Records indicate that many of the groups previously integrated into the Hunnic system, including Germanic tribes such as the Gepids and Ostrogoths, sought to assert their independence. These groups had long functioned as allies or subordinates, contributing troops and receiving a share of tribute. With the central authority weakened, the incentives that had maintained their loyalty diminished significantly. This shift altered the balance of power within the region, creating conditions for open conflict. The culmination of this process occurred in 454 CE at the Battle of Nideo. According to Jordans, a coalition of former subject peoples united against the Huns under the leadership of the Gepid king Ardaric. This alliance represented a coordinated effort to dismantle Hunnic dominance in Central Europe. The battle itself, though not extensively documented in detail, is described as a decisive confrontation in which the Hunnic forces were defeated. Elik, Attila's eldest son, is reported to have been killed during the engagement, further weakening the remaining leadership. The outcome of the Battle of Nideo effectively ended the Hunnic Empire as a unified political entity. Without a central authority capable of coordinating military and political activities, the confederation dissolved into smaller, independent groups. These groups followed different trajectories, reflecting the diversity of populations that had been incorporated into the Hunnic system. Some migrated eastward, returning toward regions of the Eurasian steppe, while others remained in Central and Eastern Europe, where they were gradually absorbed into emerging political structures. Archaeological evidence from the mid-5th century CE supports this pattern of fragmentation. Changes in burial practices, material culture, and settlement patterns indicate a decline in the unified characteristics associated with Hunnic dominance. The distribution of artifacts becomes more localized, reflecting the emergence of smaller, regionally distinct groups rather than a centralized confederation. These findings align with the historical accounts describing the rapid disintegration of Hunnic power. The sons of Attila continued to attempt to maintain elements of the confederation, but their efforts were largely unsuccessful. Dengizik, for example, engaged in further conflicts with the Eastern Roman Empire during the later 5th century. According to Byzantine sources, these campaigns ended in defeat, and Dengizik himself was killed around 469 CE. His death is often cited as one of the final markers of the decline of Hunnic political influence in the region. Ernak, another of Attila's sons, appears in some sources as leading a smaller group that maintained a degree of continuity with earlier Hunnic traditions. However, this group did not achieve the scale or influence of the previous confederation. Instead, it functioned as one among many post-Hunnic entities that emerged in the shifting political landscape of late antiquity. Over time, these groups were incorporated into other societies or disappeared from the historical record as distinct identities. Roman sources from the later 5th century CE reflect the disappearance of the Huns as a major political force. While the name Hun continued to be used in some contexts, often as a general term for steppe peoples, it no longer referred to a unified confederation capable of large-scale military campaigns. The regions once dominated by the Huns became contested spaces, with new powers, including Germanic kingdoms and the Eastern Roman Empire, seeking to establish control. The collapse of the Hunnic Empire illustrates the structural limitations of a system based on personal leadership and external resource extraction. Without mechanisms for succession or institutional continuity, the confederation was unable to withstand the loss of its central figure. The rapid fragmentation that followed Attila's death demonstrates how dependent the system had been on his authority and the distribution of resources he controlled. At the same time, the defeat at the Battle of Nideo highlights the agency of subordinate groups within the Hunnic system. These groups were not passive subjects but active participants who could reorganize and challenge existing power structures when conditions allowed. Their successful rebellion reshaped the political landscape of Central Europe, contributing to the transition from Hunnic dominance to a more fragmented and regionally diverse set of powers. By the late 5th century CE, the Huns had ceased to exist as a unified political entity, and their former territories were absorbed into the evolving structures of post-Roman Europe. Long after the disappearance of their political structure, the effects of Hunnic expansion continued to shape the trajectory of European history. The impact of the Huns extended beyond the duration of their political dominance, influencing the structural transformation of Europe during late antiquity. Their westward movements and military campaigns played a significant role in accelerating what historians refer to as the migration period, a phase characterized by large-scale population displacement and the reconfiguration of political boundaries. Beginning in the late 4th century CE, the arrival of Hunnic groups in the Pontic-Caspian region initiated a chain reaction among existing populations, particularly Germanic tribes situated along the frontiers of the Roman Empire. According to accounts by Ammianus Marcellinus, the sudden appearance of the Huns disrupted established regional dynamics. Groups such as the Goths were displaced from their territories and forced to migrate toward Roman borders. This movement resulted in increased pressure on imperial frontiers, particularly along the Danube River. The entry of Gothic populations into Roman territory, initially permitted under controlled conditions, eventually led to conflict, including the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE. While this event predates the height of Hunnic power under Attila, it illustrates the early stages of a process that would continue over subsequent decades. The continued presence and expansion of the Huns intensified these dynamics. By the 5th century CE, Hunnic campaigns under Attila the Hun contributed to the destabilization of both the Eastern and Western Roman empires. Their incursions into the Balkans, Gaul, and Italy disrupted economic systems, weakened defensive infrastructures, and required the reallocation of military resources. These pressures compounded existing internal challenges within the Roman state, including administrative fragmentation and fiscal strain. Although the Huns did not directly cause the fall of the Western Roman Empire, their actions formed part of a broader set of contributing factors. The displacement of populations and the reorganization of territories facilitated the establishment of successor kingdoms within former Roman lands. By 476 CE, when the last Western Roman emperor was deposed, the political landscape of Western Europe had already undergone significant transformation. The role of the Huns in this process is understood as catalytic, accelerating developments that were already underway. Archaeological evidence supports the interpretation of widespread disruption and transition during this period. Excavations across Central and Eastern Europe reveal shifts in settlement patterns, material culture, and burial practices corresponding to the movement of populations. The introduction of steppe-derived artifacts, including specific types of weaponry and horse equipment, indicates cultural interaction and exchange. These findings demonstrate that the influence of the Huns was not limited to military activity but extended into broader social and economic spheres. Following the collapse of their confederation in the mid-5th century CE, the Huns did not persist as a unified political entity. However, their presence continued to be reflected in historical memory and later traditions. Roman and Byzantine sources often use the term Hun as a general designation for steppe nomads, applying it to various groups encountered in subsequent centuries. This usage reflects both the lasting impression of Hunnic power and the difficulty of distinguishing between different nomadic populations in historical records. In medieval European traditions, the memory of the Huns was preserved in a range of literary and historical works. In some cases, they were associated with later groups or incorporated into genealogical narratives. For example, certain medieval sources linked the Huns with the origins of the Magyars, though modern scholarship distinguishes between these populations based on linguistic and archaeological evidence. These associations illustrate how the legacy of the Huns was adapted to fit evolving cultural and political contexts. Central Asian and Eurasian traditions also contain references to groups identified with or compared to the Huns. While direct continuity remains difficult to establish, similarities in nomadic practices and political organization have led to ongoing scholarly debate. Linguistic studies, combined with archaeological data, continue to explore the possible connections between the Huns and earlier or later steppe confederations. However, the absence of definitive written records from the Huns themselves limits the ability to draw firm conclusions. Modern historical research approaches the study of the Huns through an interdisciplinary framework, incorporating textual analysis, archaeology, and comparative studies of nomadic societies. Discoveries in regions such as the Carpathian Basin have provided new insights into Hunnic material culture, including burial assemblages and evidence of elite status. These findings contribute to a more nuanced understanding of Hunnic society, moving beyond earlier portrayals that emphasized solely their role as invaders. The reassessment of Hunnic history has also led to a broader recognition of the complexity of nomadic empires. Rather than viewing the Huns as an isolated phenomenon, scholars now situate them within a continuum of steppe polities characterized by mobility, flexible political structures, and the integration of diverse populations. This perspective highlights the capacity of such societies to exert significant influence over sedentary states, despite the absence of conventional administrative systems. The long-term effects of Hunnic expansion can be observed in the transformation of European political and cultural landscapes during the transition from antiquity to the early medieval period. The redistribution of populations, the emergence of new political entities, and the adaptation of military and diplomatic practices all reflect the impact of interactions with steppe powers. In this context, the Huns represent a key factor in the processes that reshaped Europe during the 4th and 5th centuries CE. By the end of the 5th century, the Huns had ceased to exist as a distinct political force, but their influence remained embedded in the historical developments that followed. If you found this documentary valuable, subscribe to Nightfall History for more in-depth, research-driven explorations of ancient civilizations and empires. Turn on the bell icon to stay updated with upcoming releases, and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of the Hunnic story stood out to you the most?